Good afternoon, everyone. It's Graham Cowan here, and lovely to welcome you to this third webinar in the four-webinar mental health series, specifically targeting the transport industry. In our first webinar, we talked more broadly about how we create mentally healthy workplaces. In the second one, we talked about the issues with fatigue. And we're very lucky to have Jennifer Fry and Meryl Stibbard on as well from WorkSafe. And they are the content knowledge experts for the WorkWell resource, which we'll be touching on later this week. The webinar today is about managing the risk associated with trauma. And I will just launch my screen. I must say, I had the opportunity to do quite a bit of research about the transport industry before we started this series. And it really shocked me the issues that happen in buses and in trains and in trams and even in trucks, you know. And what we're talking about today is issues related to trauma or distressing events. And that could be as simple as verbal abuse, or even physical abuse, or witnessing some really horrible incidents as well. And we do know that it is a big issue in the transport industry, and we're going to be sharing some resources from the WorkWell toolkit to show you through this. So the WorkWell toolkit, if you haven't accessed it yet, you can find it easily just by Googling WorkWell toolkit, and that will enable you to log on in, and you'll be able to see the resources that we're talking about later on today, as well as many, many other ones there. So in terms of what we're going to be talking about today, we have today people on the line who've been to all three. Some have been to two, and for some it's the first one. So there'll be a little bit of double up in terms of things that we've highlighted previously, but a really good reminder of why it's so important to have mentally healthy workplaces, how we actually promote that, and looking at the factors in the workplace that can be an issue around organisational, team, personal mental health. And then we're going through the 5 steps which are contained in the WorkWell trauma resources, and finally touching on the RUOK resources. And we love having questions, so if anything is raised, please put that in the Q&A section. It's on your screen there. If you have any issues around technical issues, please put that in the chat, because Jenny is working behind the scenes to answer any questions you might have coming up. So a little about me, for those that haven't been here previously. I worked in senior leadership in a management consulting company when there was a huge downturn in the economy. And the bottom line is that I crashed and burned. I went through 5 years of depression where I wasn't working at all. And then when I slowly came out of that, I wrote a series of books in the Back from the Brink range. And in those books, I shared stories of what helped people most in their recovery. And in my third book, which was the international version, I also actually surveyed 4,000 people to find out what worked best in their recovery. And I want to share a little bit of that today. Through my books, I met Gavin Larkin in 2009 and helped him to launch RUOK. And it's just been incredibly rewarding to see how that has grown in reach and impact. And even though Gavin passed away tragically from cancer in 2011, it's wonderful to see how this has grown and magnified. And I know there's many people in the transport industry that do celebrate RUOK. I know that, for example, those in the rail area have a special RUOK Rail Day. And what this really shows, when we do embrace this, is a culture of care. And a culture of care is probably the most important thing about having a mentally healthy workplace, because that makes you want to do things in advance to prevent it happening. And it's little things, those little interactions, those honest discussions, being authentic, are really important, as well as having the right strategy. It's what people say and do that have the biggest impact on the culture of the organisation. Just would like to do a quick survey here of everyone that's attending. And could you please just answer this question, which I will launch, no, not there, and polls. So launch poll. So if you just wouldn't mind answering that question about your view of trauma and distressing events in the transport industry. Got quite a few people voting here now. I'll give it 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. So you can see from the poll here, which I will just share results with, that 45% strongly agree it's a big issue, 41% agree. So, and one also is don't know. So what we're talking about is that 86% of people agree that workplace trauma and distressing events are a significant issue. So it's great to have you on the line, and thanks for making the time now. So why mental health and why is it important? And you may be familiar with this study by PricewaterhouseCoopers that shows that investing in employee mental health delivers a 230% return on investment. So for every dollar you put in, you get $2.30 back. So, you know, even passing a finance director's eye over it, you'd have to agree that that's a very good return on investment. Having a psychologically healthy team, a psychologically safe team, has been shown to be the #1 predictor of strong team performance. You know, Google, as an example, did a big review of their best teams around the world and found out that the #1 predictor of best teams was having team psychological safety. This is where people are comfortable being themselves. It's where there's strong interpersonal trust and respect, and people feel comfortable to take moderate risks, interpersonal risks, to improve service to their customers and also to employees generally. Now, and specifically on today's topic of trauma, you can see there that 1 in 10 of people that see traumatic events develop post-traumatic stress disorder. And, you know, it is a very disabling illness. In my books, I interviewed 3 people that have been through post-traumatic stress. One was a Vietnam veteran, and one was a truck driver. And, you know, it is a significant thing, and we're going to be building on that and just talking about it more as we progress. This is a great thing to keep in mind, because if a leader supports well-being, and you support it more, not by what you say, but by what you do, and you do that by walking the talk yourself. And so for the managers, the leaders, the business owners here, know that keeping yourself in good shape is a great predictor of creating the right environment for your employees. You know, mood is contagious. If you're in good shape, it flows on to your staff. And also vice versa, if you're not in good shape, it also has a detrimental effect to team mood, team performance. Just take 15 seconds to read this quote. I find this really interesting because we often think of Charles Darwin talking about the survival of the fittest, but as you can see, it's a much more nuanced view that he has. And when you read that, you can think that this really applies to any workplace. You know, it's the ones that survive are the most adaptable to change, live within the means available, and works cooperatively against common threats. And you'll see this thing, you know, blended in with the messages we talk about going forward. 91% of Australian employees want a mentally healthy workplace, but only 52% believe they have that, according to Beyond Blue research. And, you know, it's this survey is one done by the CSIRO, and as you can see, they predicted that rising work stress and mental health issues is a top 6 megatrend for the next 20 years. And this is before COVID-19 happened. And I'd really like to do, a big call out to all people in the transport industry and other areas in Victoria. You've just had, I guess, the very disappointing news that you've got another 6 weeks of lockdown. And this has got, I believe, also a big impact for people that are, bus drivers or conductors or on the trams, because it will raise, certainly in the short term, I believe, the stress of the Victorian people. And it stressed people that, do some pretty horrible things to drivers and conductors, station hands, etc. So we've all got to pull together, as Charles Darwin said, to collaborate to help create the right environment. This is also something I've shared each time, but it's really worth thinking about, because there are 3 categories of strategies you can look at for mental health. And if you start on the right, it's tertiary. And this is where we try to help people after they fall over, after they've had an incident, after they're stressed or depressed or have post-traumatic stress. And many firms in recent times have operated in that area. And to be honest, I know from firsthand experience that it's the slowest and the most expensive to try and help people. It's necessary, very much necessary, but it isn't the best way to invest all your time. In the middle is the secondary strategy, and this is doing things that help equip people better for events, stressful events. So it could be having resilience training or mindfulness training or meditation. It's good to have, but it's also not where the best results happen. And on your left is the primary approach. And this model came out of Professor Tony LaMontagne's work doing a peer review of research and analysing research of over 400 studies around the world. And what he concluded overwhelmingly is that the best result for employees, the best result for the organisation as a whole, is this primary approach. And this is where, to help you remember what primary is, think of preventative or proactive, really being ahead of the curve when you've got issues happening. So this is about trying to anticipate what could go wrong. And this will be the theme of what we talk about today as it relates to trauma. So this is the list of work-related factors that can increase or decrease the mental health of an organisation. And there's 11 factors there, and we can't work on 11 much. I would never advise anyone to say, I want to do all 11 at once. I would really recommend choosing one thing that you and your team would focus on for the next 90 days. Really look at focusing in control, involving your group in deciding what that is. Today, we're just talking about one of these things, which is for violent and traumatic events. And, traumatic events, it's important to note that traumatic events affect people in different ways. We shared previously that only 1 in 10 that experience those events get post-traumatic stress, but others get variable responses, more short-term than something like post-traumatic stress. But focus and look at one thing. As we talk about trauma, I think it's important to really acknowledge that some of the things we talk about in the trauma area can be a trigger for people. So if you've been through something and it does trigger you as we talk about these things, please don't hesitate to ring the support lines there or check out the websites. Our first priority is self-care, taking care of ourselves and making sure that we're in a good place. I'll never forget, about 9 years ago, I was doing a presentation to a work health safety group of managers, probably about 100 people there. And when I finished, I had a young guy come up to me, Dylan was his name, and he was probably in his late 20s. And he shared how RUOK had really helped him once. And, it was quite a harrowing story, because he shared that he'd been a diesel mechanic And while he was on a train, he saw one of those, just horrible events that sometimes train drivers see. And his organisation at that time, and it wasn't in Victoria, it was outside Victoria, didn't really have adequate things in place. And he didn't feel confident enough to really say that he was going through a tough time. But he shared with me how, for a number of years, he just had this repeating dream and nightmare, and it had a huge impact. He ended up resigning from that job and being out of work for a year or two, but finally getting the right help and coming back. Now, if he'd had ready access to things that could help right from the start, he really believes it would have turned around much faster. Most of the evidence tells us that. So as we think about Dylan, as we think about other, drivers that see tough things, truck drivers that see horrible accidents, we want to create a place where people can say they're struggling or can anticipate something that could go wrong. As we know from the safety literature, near misses are a great contributor for putting the right strategies in place.
Meet WorkSafe's WorkWell Toolkit, a tailored free online resource helping employers to create mentally healthy workplaces. Sign up and explore your custom dashboard with case studies, videos, and other useful resources that you can begin to action straight away with your team. Use a step-by-step approach and track each action. Then share the progress with your colleagues. The topics include role clarity, leadership, change management, and so many more. Creating a safe and mentally healthy workplace is good for your employees and your business. Discover the WorkWell Toolkit today.
And just a reminder from that, you can find the WorkWell Toolkit if you didn't quite catch the URL. If you Google WorkWell Toolkit, it comes up as number one on my Google, hopefully yours as well. And as you can see, it has a large range of resources there to help for specific issues that you might experience. And when you enter, you have a chance to nominate your industry, and that means that you get content specifically related to the transport industry. I know we've got some people here who aren't from the transport industry, and likewise, if you put in a different industry, you'll also see that. So we're going to dig a bit deeper into trauma, and specifically, when you go into each of these segments, it has an overview, which explains why it's important. And then there's a section called How To, and the How To generally revolves around 5 steps, and the steps with trauma is with 5 steps as well. So of course, understanding the potential impact of workplace trauma on your staff is a very, very important one. And we're going to be talking about in a moment about how we consult, how we get people to contribute, how we get people involved in solutions. But, it's also worth keeping in mind that people respond differently to these things. So just because someone says this circumstance is no problem to me, and it could well be to someone else. And so when you have your discussions with your employees, it's important to ask everyone for their view and not to shut them down. I'm going to be now sharing a short video which was put together by Phoenix Australia, which explains what workplace trauma is. And this is a resource that's in the WorkWell Toolkit, and it could be something that would work very well playing this to your employees to help start conversations.
There are moments in life that test us. They challenge our understanding of the world and our sense of safety. Natural disasters, accidents, violence. These events can come from nowhere, or they may have always been part of our life. Trauma comes in many forms. It affects thousands of Australians every day, people from all walks of life. The ripple effects of trauma impact everyone. After a traumatic event, the world can feel unpredictable and unsafe. For most people, this feeling passes with time, and with support from loved ones, life goes back to normal. But sometimes it's harder to get back on your feet. Fear, sadness, guilt, and anger are all common reactions, but when they continue for too long, they can leave you feeling helpless and exhausted. Distressing memories, images, or sounds may replay over and over in your mind. The effects of trauma start to creep into everyday life, affecting relationships. You may even pull away from important relationships and activities. You may have trouble getting a good night's sleep, and sometimes it can be tempting to reach for alcohol or other drugs. It can feel like you're on a treadmill, not making any progress, and you don't know how to get off. You're left feeling overwhelmed and trapped, and your family and friends feel helpless. But there is a way out. Effective treatments and support are available from professionals who understand trauma. You can get your life back. For information about recovery, visit phoenixaustralia.org.
I'd also, if you are specifically interested in post-traumatic stress, the Phoenix Australia is dedicated to that area. So you may also find some helpful resources there. So if step one is understanding the implications and understanding the risks that exist around trauma, step two is to, I guess, to bounce those off your staff. And one of the really important things to keep in mind if you're a manager that wants to promote honest, authentic, frank discussion is to be comfortable being vulnerable. And what that means is that, you say you don't know all the answers. People that are in the front and consumer-facing roles are often the ones that have the real stressful events. So if someone makes a suggestion and it doesn't sound quite right to you, feel comfortable saying, can you tell me more about that? If something is posed, which we don't have budget for, you can say things like, well, let's have a little trial and see if it works. And here's some other little tips that can help to have these frank discussions. And what we're talking about is not a democracy, not saying that we just vote on it. The manager and the leader have to make the call, but people are much more likely to engage in it if they're asked to participate. So, these are the questions, including talking about how to best prepare for traumatic events. Some people may have health and safety committees that would help address this, and that makes sense as well. And one-on-one discussions with employees and managers. And then look at step three. And this is the part where you really start articulating and bringing to a more definite area what you think the workplace trauma is and how this might impact your stress. So there are some guides available, and this is a word-based document, which again is on the WorkWell website, and you can just download that and customize it to meet your sort of situations. And it does include trauma in that risk assessment. Step three is to really think about it and document what your plans are. And the next part then is to prevent and manage exposure to workplace trauma. And there's 4 resources I just want to highlight here, which are part of the WorkWell trauma curated content. And one of that is risk control plans. And so you can download a PDF that explains, what is the right sequence for putting together risk control plans. More important, what I think is, really fantastic is this case studies area. And although a lot of these studies come from the healthcare sector, there's some great examples there, including a St. Vincent's Melbourne peer support program, which they put in place to help healthcare workers that are struggling with verbal abuse, physical abuse. And, ironically, the healthcare area has had lots of instances of this, just as the transport sector has. So look in there for some ideas on what could work in your workplace. If you do have a incident, it's important to analyze it properly. And this incident investigation tools helps to get to the root cause of issues that people could be experiencing. And this is a dedicated Canadian best practice trauma resource, which the WorkWell team have determined is a really great resource, even if it's in another country. If you don't know, Canada and Australia are really one of the leading lights about building psychologically healthy workplace. I've got some partners that are in Canada, and they're certainly a sophisticated group when it comes to this area. And just thinking about, the things that can be too much and the policies and procedures we can put in place that would be included in your plan. Support senior leaders. So senior leaders talk about it being an issue, acknowledge it. Again, if you remember, if a leader walks to talk about well-being, it has a flow-on effect to the employees. And particularly for frontline supervisors and managers, it's important they understand some of the risks involved and proactively determine, okay, what happens if someone experiences seeing a really traumatic event? What are the 3 things that we could suggest they do? If someone is verbally abused, what are the 3 things we could just suggest for them? And so through those case studies, through other stuff there, hopefully you'll get a plan for each of the for each type of incident that your employees determine could be an issue. And finally, evaluate and continually improve. And that's really asking, are we doing the best? Putting in place a plan for a month and then having a debrief. Is it working well? Do we need to change anything? It's about having a evolving approach. Once again, this is the WorkWell website. And so, as I said, a shortcut is Googling WorkWell Toolkit. I mentioned before that Are You OK at Work? I've got some dedicated resources for the rail industry. It's called Are You OK at Rail? And they had last month this event. It was very, very well supported by Victorian rail groups, dedicated posters and everything else. There's also one there for the motor trades industry. And we've also developed at Are You OK one for fly-in, fly-out workers. So these are people that are working remotely. And so you may find some relevance there if you have a lot of remote workers like truck drivers, etc. As I mentioned, we've done 3. We've got 1 to go in this webinar series, which is next Thursday at the same time. And it's about improving how we manage contractors and subcontractors, which can be a significant number within the workforce, the transport workforce. So we've come to the Q&A section, and I'll just ask my colleagues, Jenny Fry and also Merrill, to come on board. And we've got Jenny behind the scenes, who's been looking at the questions. And have we got any questions for myself or any of the panelists, Jenny?
Do have, Graham. There's a few that are quite similar, so I'm just going to summarise them. Firstly, I'll just let everybody know that I put the link to that toolkit in the chat box. So if you have a look in there, you can click on that and it will take you straight to the WorkWell toolkit.
Thanks.
So questions. Graham, can you, there's a couple of questions about how can leaders create the right environment for consultation with their team, make their team feel comfortable opening up?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I might share, I guess, an AFL Victorian example, and because in many parts of the transport industry, there's a high percentage of men, and I know from first-hand experience that men aren't really good about talking about feelings and what have you. But I think a remarkable example that happened was with the Richmond Tigers, and you may recall, I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago, they came in 13th. And their coach just couldn't bear this. And so he went over to the US to look at ways that he could build up greater trust and respect. And as you would know, this is, very, almost entirely male industry. And he came back with what was known as the Triple H, and that stands for Heroes, Hardships, and Highlights. And he led it by talking about the heroes in his life, the hardships he'd experienced. And one of the hardships was the previous year when they'd done so badly. And he was crabbing. His wife said he wasn't himself. And then also talked about the highlights that occurred. And so the coach led that. Damien, I think his name was. And then the captain went next week. And in the end, the whole group, all 45 in the playing squad, shared that. And it built up a level of incredible trust and resilience. And, I guess the story is they won the next year, which was, of course, an amazing thing. So when people are vulnerable, I've seen a managing director in Melbourne talk about that, talk about when he was once homeless and what happened. And people just couldn't believe it. But when you are frank, when you reveal you don't know all the answers, it then enables other people to share and builds up great interpersonal trust.
Great. Okay, so here's the question probably best for Meryl. How does the toolkit help employers to really keep their staff mentally healthy?
So the WorkWell toolkit, as Graham touched on before, takes a primary prevention approach. And what this essentially means is that you're looking at the issues at their source, the issues that create work-related stress in your workplace. The actions on the toolkit dashboard help employees by taking them through a step-by-step approach to improve the systems and the processes that impact workplace mental health. And by improving these systems, you're essentially creating an environment that's protective to the mental health of your employees. How we start is we help you understand what the risks are in your workplace. And once you've identified these, you can access the practical and relevant resources that Graham took you through before as some examples that are going to help you address the specific issues in your workplace.
Great. And what are some of the work-related factors that are addressed in that toolkit?
So the toolkit covers all 11 of the work-related factors within our actions on our dashboard. We touched on the trauma action before, and Graham took us through the steps involved in completing that action. Other actions include respect, role clarity, support, leadership, and there's many more. And we're working towards finding the best resources to help employees address these factors. And are continually improving and updating the toolkit when new tools and resources become available. And we know that improving workplace mental health isn't just about doing the one thing, although that's a really great place to start. The toolkit helps employers to create a workplace environment that supports good mental health by addressing all of those work-related factors.
Great. We've got a couple of questions also around trauma, so I'll address those to Jennifer. What are some of the most common traumas that you are seeing that people in the transport industry are being exposed to?
Well, look, Graham said it really nicely before that, different people find different events traumatic. So it does mean that everyone, in a way, can be at risk of being impacted by trauma. But of course, in transport, you do sometimes have those really big critical incidents that do involve people being injured or killed. So of course there's those big events, but sometimes it's the other things that are also traumatic to some people. And look, it may be cumulative. You might have people in your workplaces who've experienced lots of different traumatic events, either personally or during work, and they've always been resilient. But then there's some event that is like the straw that breaks the camel's back, and then they become unwell because of that. Sometimes trauma in workplaces is not just transport, but it can be frontline staff dealing with aggression. And Graham's mentioned that as well, that in the society that we're in, that sometimes we don't have a great amount of control of customers that we're dealing with. Or it could be vicarious trauma. And what that is when people are either hearing stories or just dealing with other people's trauma, and then they themselves experience a traumatic response. So I guess going back, that it is varied, and that's why, as Graham said, that doing that consultation with your staff is just so important, so that you can actually understand from your staff's perspective what the trauma is that they had experience of, or what they're worried about, or what they just think might actually happen. So I guess what we're saying is we need to address trauma as a risk in the same way that you address other OHS issues. So the process is the same. So it's consulting with your staff, understanding it. It's really doing a risk assessment, the same as you do with other OHS risks. And it is coming up with those controls, and it is recording that information. And I think with trauma, what we know is that by doing this up front, by being prepared, you've done the thinking and the planning prior to a traumatic event happening. And then if everyone in your workplace knows that plan, you give people the best chance of not being negatively impacted by that trauma.
Great. So what are some of the ways that you can perhaps prevent employees being exposed to trauma?
Look, there's some events we can't anticipate, we know that, but sometimes you can actually control the risk. And it is looking at the root causes of the trauma. And so it's using, as I just said, that really step-by-step approach. A lot of us have started talking about systems thinking, and what do we mean by that? It means by going right back down to the root cause. So what is the systems issue that's actually caused the trauma? So thinking in that way, thinking about how your work is designed, is fatigue maybe one of the factors? Is it that your customers are unhappy with your processes? So can you fix the process? So I guess it's really digging deep so that you can understand the potential causes, and if you can control them, do control them. Beyond Blue did some, and Graham mentioned some Beyond Blue research before, and they did some research with emergency services across Australia, and looked at their exposure to trauma, which as we know is really significant. But I think we can apply some of the learnings to transport as well. And one of the findings that Beyond Blue came out with was that having a psychologically healthy workplace culture to start with, and as Meryl said, having those 11 work-related factors in the positive, that actually provides protection to your people after a traumatic event. So the research told us that for those emergency services workplaces, if their existing culture at work was positive, they might have experienced the same amount of trauma, but their people didn't end up mentally unwell, didn't have as much likelihood of developing PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So coming back to that real primary prevention approach that Graham mentioned is really the key.
Okay, so the next question says, we have kill sheets distributed daily of people who have died on the roads, and staff attend to investigate, which managers sort of dismiss as part of the job. So how do we lead into this conversation with managers for better understanding?
I might just jump in quickly, and then Meryl or Jenny might like to add something to this. With this area, it really, it should be, a zero target. And I saw an amazing example of this when I visited the Henry Ford Health Service, and it's a managed fund in the US based in Detroit. And the lead psychiatrist there decided to apply for a grant. And what made it quite revolutionary is that they went for, and they look after 3 million people, is that they decided to make their target zero, that no death from suicide was acceptable, that it was going to be zero. And they really had an approach similar to what, some of the car manufacturers had, like Toyota, where they asked 5 whys after everything that goes wrong. And so they look at those near misses and really go deep and identify what the root cause is, because it's very easy to say the first thing you see is the issue, but when you unpick it, you might find that the staff is really stressed or they haven't been trained properly. And they actually got, and a lot of people couldn't believe this, actually got to zero for 3 million people that they looked after. And that was just what seems like simple things like, banning weapons that could facilitate, or things that could facilitate suicide, about training their staff in cognitive behaviour therapy. But they only got there by really having that plan that no death is satisfactory. And I would say that managers need to really understand that as well, that it's just not something that we have to live with. We can consciously do something about that. But Jennifer or Mel would like to add something as well.
Graham, I completely agree. I mean, I think, in society, it is a wicked problem and there isn't a simple solution. But I think we can do better, and by really thinking in that very deep system way of getting right down to what are the causes, the original stressors, and what are the things that we can actually change. Someone in the chat has asked, as safety practitioners, they're not medically trained in mental health, but I think this is not necessarily just mental health. It's actually a work design, a systems issue that I think by continually asking questions and by continually digging deeper, it's actually what is it about the design of work that we can change. I also just want to add that, in terms of being prepared for trauma, I think as organisations we can do a bit more in terms of documenting what we're going to do if a traumatic event happens, so that you can do that pre-planning, allocating roles so that people know what their job is, know how to contact people, know how to contact families, maybe set up peer support sorts of structures in your organisation. Know your EAP provider if you've got one. I mean, small organisations may not, but that there will be counsellors and professionals within your region or your community. If you don't know how to find those, go to your primary health network, or the federal government's got Health Direct, which is, we can put that into the follow-up email if you want as well. So find out who your local services are. So basically have a clear plan so that if an event happens, you can follow that plan.
Thanks. There's just been something else put in chat as well. Thanks for that, Jennifer, about, what you do for people that could be having a mental health crisis because of COVID-19. I think that's a very real risk in Victoria at the moment. And don't assume that you have to know everything. I've done lots and lots of research of what helps people the most. And the most important thing is having someone caring and supportive around them, and preferably being able to guide them to where they can get help. And I remember one of my books, my second book, which was about carers, and one woman just said that the most affirmative thing that happened was her best friend saying, "I don't understand what you're going through. I don't know what it feels like, but I'm here for you no matter what." And she said that reassurance was just fundamental. She said, in terms of her recovery, for her, it was the most important thing. So don't underestimate being caring and supportive. We've gone well over here, which is always great. It's great to be answering questions. We're at 1:43. So unless there's something that Jenny or Mary
just
say?
One more question that popped up in the chat box. So this is one that's going to be relevant for everybody. So what are the resources that we can use to convince duty holders that there is a return investment? So say $2.30 in every $1 invested in safety. Now, I think, Jennifer, you've got some resources that you can send out. Is that right?
Yeah, look, I think we'll just link everyone to that PricewaterhouseCoopers report where that statistic comes from. It's a few years old now, but it's probably still the most relevant. So we'll put that into an email to follow up to participants.
You've also got an action on the toolkit specific to creating a business case to influence your leaders to start making these changes as well.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks Jennifer. Thanks Meryl. Thanks Jenny. And I look forward to seeing you next week when we talk about how we help improve the mental health of contractors and subcontractors. All the best.